Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for joining us for our first philosophy lecture series this semester. My name is Boram Jung. I am an assistant professor of philosophy. I have to read this to say this. This institution, CU Denver. First, I would like to thank the philosophy department, women's and gender studies program, and political science department for sponsoring this event. As members of the University of Colorado Denver, we would like to acknowledge that the university sits on land within the territories of Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. Further, we acknowledge that 48 contemporary tribal nations are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. And I have a great honor to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Megan Burke. Dr. Burke is assistant professor of philosophy at Sonoma State University. There, her book, When Time Warps, The Lived Experience of Gender, Race, and Sexual Violence, published last year with University of Minnesota Press, is an inquiry into the phenomenology of women based in the relationship between lived time and sexual violence. Dr. Burke also co-organized the first trans philosophy conference in the US. Hey. And has published numerous articles on heteronormativity and queer sexualities in journals like Hypatia, Philosophia, and Feminist Theory. Today, Dr. Burke's talk highlights talk highlights how colonial processes of gender are lived and constituted through the lived experience of time, and how colonial gender and time are produced by sustained legacies of racialized sexual violence. Please give our speaker a round of
Thank you all for being here. I am so happy to be here to present my work, and it's been a very short 24 hours, but it's all been very hospitable. So thank you. Thank you to Baram and John especially for all the details of organizing. It's been very seamless. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I've organized things, then I'll introduce the kind of larger project of the book, and then kind of zoom in to some details. So the title of the talk is Colonial Temporality and the Racialization of Women. You can find that on this handout, which I'll refer to at various points, but mostly to draw attention to quotes. But there's some other good things on the handout. That's in particular a discount code if you ever want to buy the book. However, if you don't want to buy my book, but you might want to buy other books in gender and sexuality with University of Minnesota Press, this discount code will also work for them too. So just FYI, it is a more generalizable code. So the handout I'll refer back to at various points, but feel free to do whatever you will with that. And I want to kind of introduce the talk in particular just by drawing your attention to the epigraph that is on the handout, and that's from Maria Lugones, a decolonial Latina feminist philosopher, who writes, "To see non-white women is to exceed categorical logic." So the talk I'll give today, and the way the book unfolds around this particular quote, or the way this talk that I'll give, is really rooted in this quote, as I was trying to wrestle with what this quote means, and how to make sense of what is being kind of said to us all. So the talk in many ways is motivated by me trying to make sense of what it is that Lugones is trying to open up for us. So as I was kind of thinking about this, the questions that I was asking myself was, how do we make phenomenological sense of this claim? Meaning, how do I make sense of this claim at the so-called level of lived experience? And then how, in particular, is the category of woman constituted and lived as white? So much has been said in feminist scholarship and feminist philosophy in particular around how norms of gender are constructed around race and colonial legacies. less has been said about how it is lived through those legacies. So that became a big kind of question for me as a phenomenologist who's really interested in the experience of norms. So how do we come to live out these histories of race, gender, and sexual violence, with us? How do we carry them with us? And then in particular, what does it have to do with time? I became really interested in this question of time, and hopefully I'll be able to unpack for you in some ways why. So before I begin into the specifics of the talk and in relation to that quote, I wanted to say something brief about the larger project of the book, just to kind of invite you into kind of what you're getting a window into. So I know there's some of you in the room who've read the book. Thank you. I promise to hopefully not bore you, and hopefully at the end I'll gesture to some questions that I now have as a result of writing this book, so that we can kind of maybe talk together in some ways. So for the rest of you, though, in the book I take up the theme of time, or lived time, how it is we live time, in particular how we live gender in through relations to time. And in particular in relation to trauma, one that is from a feminist perspective deeply gendered, so that is the trauma of sexual violation, to be specific, and the lived experience of that trauma in relationship to the experience of normative womanhood, or what I call, following feminist philosopher Simone de Beauvoir's notion of feminine existence. So as I'm talking about women, I'm talking about the norm of women and how that comes to be lived out. So knowing that most people don't live it out in its ideal, but that it is a norm that gets imposed and taken up in lived experience. So Beauvoir calls this kind of norm, or as I read Beauvoir, calls this norm feminine existence. And so I'm trying to give an account of how what the relation between trauma and feminine existence is, and the trauma of sexual violation in particular. And so I do so by developing a phenomenology of time, and making sense of the lived experience of time. So my work breaks with previous work in three significant ways, or at least as I understand it. So first is the perspective of classical phenomenology, and in particular the discussion that Edmund Husserl gives us of time consciousness and the notions of retention and protension. So for those in the room who are not familiar with that discussion, the very kind of well-known example that phenomenologists give is the one of a melody. So when we hear a melody, when we hear a song or a sound, we retain notes that came before. This is how we can kind of remember or hum the tone, and then that is the retention. We retain the notes that have previously existed, and we protend, or we have this expectation of the notes that are to come. So this retention and protension is a big way that this is how we experience time. This is how Husserl understands this. So that experience of time is both impressional, that's the retention, you kind of retain something from the past, and expectational or anticipatory, that there's some relation to the future, and this is how we live kind of the present in this relation. So Husserl and other classical phenomenologists think of this as the general experience of time that's central to human subjectivity. I suggest, though, that the temporalization of subjectivity, this experience of time and being kind of temporalized, coming to be a subject in relation to time, is not something that is general and that just underlies a subject, or that is found beneath the empirical and political and social existence of power. So I think Husserl misses this entirely. And so as others who are trying to politicize questions of time, that's what I'm trying to do in the work too, to suggest that this account of retention and protension that Husserl offers doesn't at all take into account the way that the social and political world inflects the experience of time. So for me, it's right here, and by here I mean in this living present, in our bodies, so this becomes important to me, that we find the marks of historical injustice, and this changes how one experiences the relation between the past and the present. If one can experience that relation at all. So that's a question that I ask. So that's the first part. The second break is with a practice in feminist phenomenology, which has most typically focused on the question of space, and in particular how women take up space and how that mode of taking up space becomes a part of what actualizes one's gendered embodiment. So Iris Marion Young's account of throwing like a girl is kind of the most famous example of this, that those who become girls and women do so through a particular mode of bodily comportment that they learn in relationship to gender. So instead of focusing on space, I shift the question to time and ask, well, what does time have to do with this experience of gender subjectivity? So third, I focus on the time prior to trauma rather than the aftermath of trauma. So most thinkers who pose questions about sexual violation philosophically or psychologically ask about the aftermath of sexual violation, and I shift the focus to the anticipation of that trauma. So in doing so, I'm asking how, to connect the first and last, I'm asking how that anticipation is bound to a heavy historical past, and how that historical past is part of our foreboding, meaning our kind of future relation. So a central part of this is to understand how the historical past gets in the present of our gendered embodiment. Or to use Husserlian language, it's to understand how history shows up in retentional consciousness. Though I follow, as I'll talk about, Maurice Merleau-Ponty's notion of consciousness is deeply embodied. So I'm kind of interested in how that history gets entrenched in our bodily lives. So that's kind of the general scope. But what I'll present you today is really focused on this latter question of how the historical past gets anchored into retentional consciousness in our embodied lives. And so this is really attention to the first break, the first question. I will end, though, at a gesture to that last break, the question of anticipation. So in this talk, the question I'm most interested in is this is how I would put it. How does the concrete historical legacy of heteropatriarchal colonialism show up in the present vis-a-vis or in the lived experience of gender? So I'll just read that again. How does the concrete historical legacy of heteropatriarchal colonialism, particularly as it is enacted through sexual violation, how does it show up in the present vis-a-vis the lived experience of gender? So that is, how is this legacy a generative past that slides into the contemporary experience of gender in a way that elides the present, meaning we don't really notice it, and so enacts a new iteration of past operations of colonial sexual violation. So rather than just saying that history merely repeats itself, I'm asking how does it morph in certain ways through our embodied lives such that it changes, but it also doesn't. So it's not a mere repetition, but there's something going on there, and time for me has something to do with it. So these questions for me are motivated in large part by Black and decolonial feminist thinkers who insist that we ask, how is gender racialized and how is race gendered? And the feminist phenomenological question, if gender is a lived phenomenon, so it's not merely a construct, right? It's something more than that. So if gender is a lived phenomenon, then how do we make sense of how these histories are lived, how the past gets into our present life? This question is meant to suggest that we need an account of how history gets in the body through gender, so that the subject is historical not only in the sense that we stand in the stream of history, that there is this historical past, but in the sense that history runs through us all. Or to draw on Merleau-Ponty, it's to point out that the subject is not merely in time, again, as this historical thing, but that the subject is time itself. Or, and this is a quote from the Phenomenology of Perception, that time is not an object of knowledge, but a dimension of our being. So how are histories of colonial sexual violation lived today via gender? How are norms of gender kind of lived out through these histories? That is, when one becomes a woman, how is she living out histories of race through woman in particular? Or how are those of us who are supposed to become women kind of living out and negotiating those histories as we negotiate who we are as gendered people? My specific claim is that contemporary normative gender formations inherit colonial racism and state violence against women of color through the racialization of time. This means that normative genders are lived, undertaken, and negotiated in the service of racialized, gendered, state sexual violation of women of color through the lived experience of time. So it's the latter part that's kind of my contribution. There's many other feminist scholars who've said much more about the details of how that state violence operates and kind of what it looks like. So for me, that lived experience of time kind of reiterates or reifies, it entrenches what I'm calling a racial prohibition on woman, and this is what I think Lugonis is gesturing to. So that's kind of what I'm trying to make sense of. So here's how the talk will proceed. So that was a long introductory remark, so I'm going to just make a few more, and then this is the outline I offer you on your handout. I'll discuss the coloniality of gender and time. I'm going to read Maria Lugonis's account in a bit more detail in relationship to Anival Quijano and Walter Mignolo's discussion of colonial chronology. So that's kind of how I'm going to tease out this claim of the racial prohibition on women. And then third, I'll consider how legacies of colonial rape are deployed to kind of temporalize, to make into existence the coloniality of gender. So in that third section is where I'll have some more specific, though not too detailed as I get in the book, discussions of sexual violation. So that's kind of where maybe the heavier stuff for some of us will come in. And then I'll end with some just brief concluding remarks, and that's where I'll gesture to the questions I opened for myself and that I still don't know how to make sense of. So maybe you will, which would be great for me. Okay. So I'll get into the introductory remarks. So as a phenomenologist and a feminist phenomenologist in particular, it's always important for me to kind of concretize the questions I have, meaning kind of what are the historical and social conditions today that are raising these questions for me. So one of them, of course, was Lugonis' quote and trying to negotiate that, but also one of the other ones was trying to make sense of what was happening in Oklahoma City. When former police officer Daniel Holtzclaw was convicted of committing numerous rapes and sexual assaults against 13 African American women, ranging in age from 17 to 57. He was sentenced to 263 years in prison. Many people thought this was like a moment to celebrate, although those of us interested in prison abolition have lots of different feelings around this. But nevertheless, I became interested in what the trial prosecutor, District Attorney Lori McConnell, said in her closing statement. So this is the first quote on the handout. This is what McConnell says. He didn't choose CEOs or soccer moms. He chose women he could count on not telling what he was doing. He counted on the fact that no one would believe them and no one would care. What McConnell was actually saying, of course, was that Holtzclaw chose his victims because they were Black women. They were not white soccer moms who, in the eyes of the law, the state, and many residents of Oklahoma, are respectable women, quasi-women, protected women, the kind of women a cop does not target to rape. Unfortunately, the dehumanization and trauma endured by the 13 Black women for the pleasure and power of Holtzclaw is but one event in a deep history of state violence against women of color in the United States. The use of rape against women of color has a particularly pernicious and troubling history. Other feminist scholars have documented the disturbingly multiple, intricate, explicit, and nuanced ways that colonial conquest sanctions and uses rape against non-white, non-Western, immigrant, and indigenous women at rates far higher and often in ways far more brutal than white Western women. This reality is even more sinister when one takes seriously that such rape has been systematically concealed and justified by racist colonial governments and their white citizens. In the contemporary United States, with the exception of American Indian victims, the rape of women by men is largely an intraracial phenomenon. So that means white men are most likely to rape white women, Black men are most likely to rape Black men, but the exception here is that American Indian women seem to be subjected to rape by those outside their racial ethnic group. So the rape of women by men is largely an interracial phenomenon that occurs not through the appendages of the state, but is perpetrated by men who women know. Today's landscape, exemplified by Holtzclaw, though, emerges from a long history of state-sanctioned rape of women of color before and after slavery with total impunity. So I started to kind of want to make sure we hold on to that history to say that this isn't an exception, right? That Holtzclaw isn't kind of doing this exceptional thing, that there's actually something normal happening here, and that we're running the risk of seeing it as exceptional. And so that's kind of why I start with Holtzclaw, trying to kind of re-entrench this as part of a legacy and think about how it's showing up in other places that seem less violent and as if things are different. So the institutional rape of women of color at the hands of the state, as Patricia O'Collins shows, has not been eliminated. It has only changed form. Rather than focus on the specificity of each history, I am trying to make a more general claim about the subjective constitution, meaning the way subjectivity is actualized of normative gender in relation to these diverse histories of sexual violation. That runs a lot of risks, which I tried to say I'm aware of, kind of collapses, right, the specific details into a more general claim. But I think that it's important, and nevertheless. So to make sense of how that changing form gets into the lived body or lived gender, this is language phenomenologists use, I focus on what Black feminist scholar Brittany Cooper calls the racial politics of time. Consideration of the way time is racialized, the way time is owned by white people, elucidates the way racialized temporality structures both gender as a social category and the normative experience of woman, and is a justificatory apparatus, meaning it's what justifies state violence against women of color. So that would be the racial politics of time. Following women of color, feminist thinkers like Cooper, I suggest that contemporary normative gender formations inherit colonial racism and state violence against women of color through this racialization of time. So why do we need this account? Well, in one sense, understanding how time structures racialized gender allows us to make sense of some of the racialized disparities and differences between the experiences of white women and women of color, or those who are perceived to be as such, in relation to state violence and contemporary anti-rape movements. So in the book, I briefly gestured at how this can help us make some sense of what's going on in how race undercuts the Me Too movement, for instance. And in another sense, it also helps us make sense of how the very lived experience of gender can reify histories of violence in ways that slide out of view as reiterations of the past. I argue that a racialized colonial structure of linear temporality is dialed into feminine existence through a conceptual apparatus of a colonial gender system, and that system is materially instituted at the tangible level through historical deployments of sexualized violation against colonized females. That's to use Lugonis's terms. This linear temporality institutes an operation of sexualized dehumanization that denies human status to women of color by denying them the very category of gender. So that's kind of where I'm going to go. So now I'm going to kind of bring us into the second and largest section on the coloniality of gender and time. So those of you who are familiar with Lugonis and Mignolo, bear with me. For those who don't, I hope this makes sense. So one of the most important contributions to feminist philosophical thinking about the co-constitution of gender and race, how they're kind of produced in relationship together, they're always entangled as a colonial process, is philosopher Maria Lugonis's account of the colonial modern gender system. Lugonis's primary task in her work on gender is to situate contemporary gender formations within the historical and ideological context of colonial conquest and racial identity formation. For Lugonis, the modern system of gender as a binary social classification and lived reality emerges out of and as a weapon of the concrete material practices and epistemology of colonial domination. I think this is such a radical way to think about how gender is a weapon of colonial conquest. This is one of the things that Lugonis is trying to gesture kind of and train our attention to. Lugonis develops her account of gender as a colonial racial formation through a feminist appropriation of Anibal Quijano's notion of the coloniality of power. For Quijano, the coloniality of power means a system of control and domination that emerges in relation to but is distinct from the historical events of European colonialism. So So the coloniality of power is this overarching power structure that continues on as colonialism changes in various ways. The concept, Quijano argues, offers a way to articulate the integration and justification of colonial ideology and conquest into ways of thinking and being in the modern world. According to Lugones, and I would agree, Quijano does not pay critical attention to the role of gender in the production and maintenance of the coloniality of power. In contrast, she argues that coloniality is in fact structured by new gender formations that constitute and are constituted by race. So here's the second quote on the handout. This is from Lugones. And the sources are on the back if you want to look later. Colonialism did not impose pre-colonial European gender arrangements on the colonized. It imposed a new gender system that created very different arrangements for colonized males and females than for white bourgeois colonizers. For Lugones, the new gender system, what she names the colonial modern gender system, is established and structured by a racialized sex-gender distinction. She argues that the new gender system includes the institution of particular gender categories of man and woman as civilizing categories that humanize and racialize bodies as white and human, and thus as superior to colonized people. So if anyone has read any of Judith Butler's work, say in Gender Trouble, where Butler says gender humanizes, I actually see Lugones kind of offering us an intervention that shows how Butler kind of misses the way race also is part of the humanizing function of gender here. So this racialization of gender requires the imposition and projection of a dimorphic notion of sex onto the colonized. Accordingly, accordingly, in the colonial modern gender system, the colonized are understood as female or male, categories that demarcate their animal, non-human, and therefore uncivilized status. As Lugones puts it, and this is the third quote on the handout, it's longer. Beginning with the colonization of the Americas and the Caribbean, a hierarchical dichotomous distinction between human and non-human was imposed on the colonized in the service of Western man. It was accompanied by other dichotomous hierarchical distinctions, among them that between men and women. This distinction became a mark of the human and a mark of civilization. Only the civilized are men or women. Indigenous peoples of the Americas and enslaved Africans were classified as not human in species, as animals, uncontrollably sexual and wild. Ultimately, she argues that a central structure of colonial power is a racialized sex-gender distinction, which reserves and confers gender onto white bodies and sex onto black bodies, therefore creating and reinforcing colonial racial difference via gender. As forms of social classification, Lugones claims gender humanizes the colonizers, while sex dehumanizes the colonized. From this view, the marks of white gender and black sex generate and systematize colonial difference and make the category women of color a logical impossibility. The confluence of colonial and racial gender formations, white man and white woman, are the terms that mark off who counts as woman. The coloniality of gender makes it such that, and this is Lugones as well, no women are colonized, no colonized females are women. To be a female, for instance, makes one not woman and thus non-human. On this reading, the sex-gender distinction, again, is humanizing. The racial mark is a mark of being an animal. While I don't disagree with Lugones' account of this colonial racial distinction between female and woman, I think there's more to understand about the construction of the differences itself. Both if we want to make sense of how it relates to the world we find ourselves in today, but also to make sense of how it is that Lugones suggests that sex and gender are not connected, which is not how many people think of these terms today. This pushes back on lots of discussions, from feminist discussions to queer discussions to trans discussions. Lugones suggests they're not connected at all, and I kind of I'm asking, well, how is this so? If woman requires the negation of female, such that woman is tied to female, but those who are marked as female cannot become women, then how is the separation upheld? So there's some there's some interesting connection between female as not woman, but woman needing this category of negation of female. So I'm trying to say, well, how is it that those who are marked female cannot become women? Right? How do we make sense of that? If our answer is race, it's just racial difference, we run into circular logic. So we answer the question with the terms of the question, since female and women are already raced. What holds the classification together while also keeping them separated? This is where I want to suggest the colonial distinction of time can help us answer that question. Although often neglectful of a critical discussion of gender, discussions of temporality in Latin American philosophy offer invaluable insights into the way the colonial conception of time as linear racially orders existence. According to Quijano, the geopolitical landscape carved out by the institution of race imparts meaning on geography and the people who inhabit it, which is in part secured through a new conception of time. These shifts in relation to space and time matter because they sediment and justify colonial ideology as a system and as a European sensibility, how we make sense of ourselves and the world. In particular, Quijano argues that a past-future dichotomy underlies the colonized, colonizer, non-human, human distinction, and this in turn positions the colonizers as temporally superior, as in kind of civilized, as in the future, and makes a relation to time, in particular a relation to the past, a form of dehumanization. This temporal dehumanization discloses what I call the temporal ontological violence of Eurocentric epistemology, so that those who are uncivilized are stuck in the past and kind of anchored there, while those settlers among us are kind of ahead in the future. Walter Mignolo further develops the account of the coloniality of time, suggesting that time, and this is also on your handout, functions, quote, as a principle of order that increasingly subordinates places, relegating them, the colonized, to places and people, relegating them, the colonized, to before or below from the perspectives of the holders of the doors of time. That echoes back to kind of Cooper's claim that white people, we own time. The relegation of the colonized as prior to the future situates the colonized as fully in the past and thus temporally dislocated from humanity. This temporal separation or dislocation is paradoxical, however. Although the colonial view makes a clear distinction between the uncivilized past and the civilized present, there is a constitutive or productive relationship between them. The uncivilized past is a necessary antecedent to civilized time. The coloniality of time is thus a temporal order that relies on a hierarchical inseparability between the uncivilized past and the civilized present and future. So that in order for the time to be conceived of as linear, the separation isn't absolute, right? There's always this kind of specter of the uncivilized past. It needs to be there in order for the present and future to be kind of established as the colonizer's time. The temporal order is linear. People and places are situated on a timeline, one that has, according to Quijano, Mignolo, and Lugones, epistemic and ontological significance. So even as there are various historical and material relations of race globally, and even among the geopolitical terrain of the United States, the coloniality of time is a helpful conceptual framework for explaining why racialized subject positions are bound to Eurocentric notions of time. When read alongside Lugones' account of the coloniality of gender, it is possible to see how the colonial timeline structures and manifests as the colonial sex-gender distinction. Indeed, the linear temporal ordering should be understood as that which organizes the racialized difference between sex and gender. The civilizing category woman is structured by a relation to an uncivilized female past. In the colonial schema, sex is the temporal antagonist prior to or anterior to gender. And this temporal relation draws attention to what I call the constitutive inseparability, that they're entangled together, they can't be pulled apart between black female and white woman. So that means woman needs this kind of uncivilized past of sex. If woman is to mark the human, it must be done so through and against the specter of its uncivilized civilized past of sex. Female is the mark of the wild or pre-human past, a past that must be negated, but that is nevertheless internal to the norm of woman, for without that past, woman could not exist. The linear ordering of sex and gender as a racialization of time thus constructs woman as a head of, in a racist evolutionary sense, female. According to this developmental temporal logic of the colonial sex-gender distinction, a woman is the human progression of a female animal. But for woman to exist, the category must bear a negative relation to female, which means an imposition of dimorphic sex is necessary to a racial operation of gender. Because one of the things that happens in imagining the colonized as animals is that sex is not contained. It's so excessive that it exceeds like dimorphic bodily difference. But Lugonis suggests that the imposition of dimorphic sex is necessary. And so that imposition for me takes place in this separation between this pre-human, uncivilized sex and human woman. So this point suggests that woman is a normative category rendered white only through a binding rejection of sex as the past. To maintain the relegation of the colonized to the past, the linear relation between sex and gender must be fissured. That is, it must be impossible for the colonized to become human. And this is where the colonial imaginary of wild sex becomes important. The simultaneous mark of race and sex produces the impossibility for Black females to be intelligible or to show up in the present as women in the colonial gender schema. The coloniality of gender is not just a byproduct of the coloniality of being in time, however. Rather, the coloniality of gender is central to the use of time as a colonizing device. The colonial modern gender system is one of the deeply visceral ways colonial linearity is taken up and materializes in the lived experience, in lived experience. So in other words, thinking about time can be quite abstract, right? So like the coloniality of time, okay, great. I think one of the things that Lugonis is suggesting is that gender becomes this very visceral, tangible way that coloniality enters in us and how we carry it on. And so that this means that, gender is part of the tool that continues to perpetuate the coloniality of time. So now I'm going to go to the third section. So what does this have to do with the colonial history of rape? And why and how were Black colonized people distinguished from one another at all? So the temporalization of humanity vis-a-vis racialized gender is not achieved through a mere discursive or conceptual mark of new colonial classifications. We also have to make sense of how gender comes to be instituted as white. It is realized through the sexual abuse and use of colonized females. That's at least the claim I want to make. So that the temporalization of gender as humanizing, as white, is realized, it's made real through the sexual abuse and use of colonized females. More specifically, the use of state-sanctioned rape has long played a central role in the institution and organization of the colonial modern gender system. So I'll give one example here, though I have others we can talk about later. In Women, Race, and Class, Angela Davis accounts for the making of the category Black woman in the following way. This is the second to last quote on the handout. The slave system defined people as chattel. Since women, no less than men, were viewed as profitable labor units, they might as well have been genderless as far as the slaveholders were concerned. Black women were practically anomalies. Anticipating Lugonis's claim, Davis suggests the very existence of enslaved Black women was practically impossible insofar as the material conditions of slavery minimized any differences between enslaved females and males, to use Lugonis's language. The exception, as Davis suggests, to the racialized gender neutrality of slavery is the experience of rape. That experience is central in enslaved Black women's existence. She writes, this is in the quote, not on the handout, but women suffered in different ways than men as well. They were victims of sexual abuse and other barbarous treatment that could only be inflicted on women. So following Davis, among other women of feminist scholars who echo a similar tone, the gender difference among slaves or other colonized peoples was thus realized and made through the use of sexual violations like rape. This point about the legibility of Black women through racialized colonial sexual violation, meaning how we get to see Black women as distinct from Black men, extends far beyond Black slaves. This practice of colonial gendering has long been imposed on all non-white women, although in different ways and for different reasons. For Ligonis, this use of rape is what she calls the dark side of the colonial modern gender system, the sexually violent undercurrent that gives rise to the humanizing genders of coloniality. Colonial linearity is a vital operation of this dark underside, I think, insofar as it produces and pardons the physically violent dehumanization of colonized subjects. However, the temporal difference between woman and female also materializes in large part through racialized rape. Even though, as Ligonis notes, white women are also marked by sexual violability, meaning that they are also subjected to rape, in the colonial schema, because they are classified as human, their relation to a white settler man confers some hold on the future, although deeply tenuous because of sexual violation and relative because the future is. Ultimately, though, this temporal demotion and mark of sex institutes and is the colonial difference between white woman and Black female, and this temporalization materializes or comes to life through rape and other forms of sexual conquest. To be marked as the gender woman thus requires a particular relation to time that is realized through and historically requires the use of rape against women of color, a use which is itself through the ideology of colonial temporality. In this way, the colonial use of rape can be understood itself as a temporal ordering device of gender, and temporality can be understood as a mechanism that justifies colonial uses of rape. Both of these, I think, structure normative gender formations. So now I'm going to get to some of the concluding remarks and to bring us back to kind of Holtzclaw. So what does this all say about the lived experience of norms and racialized gender today? In The Erotic Life of Racism, Sharon Patricia Hollins asks a provocative question about the spatio-temporal structure of contemporary racism. This is the last quote on your handout. What happens when someone who exists in time meets someone who only occupies space? In the context of the analysis I've offered here, Hollins' question can be one way to ask, what happens when a white man meets a Black female? What happens when a Black female crosses the state, or even when she crosses a white woman? For Holland, the answer is reminiscent of Frantz Fanon's account of the epidermal racial schema in Black skin, white masks. Holland draws attention to the way racialized subjectification, meaning becoming a racialized subject, renders the Black body not simply inferior, but non-existent as a body subject. Describing her own experience of an encounter with a white woman, which I won't go into detail here, Holland remarks how her presence in that very present encounter, in that moment with the white woman, was, quote, yoked to the needs and desires of her white female counterpart. For Holland, the Black subject in the white temporal plane became a mere thing to be moved. The Black subject becomes constituted as space, because the meeting of the Black subject and the white subject do not occur in the same temporally located in different places. In a racist milieu, this means the Black subject is not a maker of time. She does not exist as a subject spread out over and living in a dynamic tension as phenomenology has it with the past, present, and future. Rather, the Black subject is spatial, not only relegated to the past, but stuck there. This colonial temporal relegation turns into a spatial positioning. Holland, as a Black woman, becomes stuck. And my claim is that she gets hurled into the, quote, uncivilized past. Yet the colonized subject is not merely in the past, she is a past that is present. And so as a past that must be constantly constituted or produced in the kind of sense of being, this ontological sense, as a pastness herself. She gets anchored in the colonial chronology of racialized gender. Sarah Ahmed conceives of the normative violence of colonial process in primarily spatial terms, namely as a racialized straightening mechanism or a way of keeping existence in a white line. This is in her work in Queer Phenomenology. According to Ahmed, the consequence of this spatial constitution is restricted. So these are bodies who get stopped, so we can make a lot of sense of this in terms of police stops and policed violence. So whether or not verbalized, this kind of questioning of being stopped, of being stoppable, of being asked why you're here, if you belong here, and so forth, is a way of asking if one belongs in the present. It is a kind of temporal questioning that underlies a racial social fabric, framing the Black body as questionable from the start. To be questionable is to already be in the mode of an impoverished temporal existence. It is to have one's existence, one's being put on trial. So in this way, what's happening to Holtzclaw, right, is the very ordinary experience of what it means to be constituted as pastness, although different too. In the lived experience of the coloniality of gender, being in question is the refusal of humanizing gender. From this view, we can make some phenomenological sense of Lugonis's claim to see non-white women is to exceed categorical logic. Although women of color do exist, the racialized temporality of their existence undercuts not only our ability, kind of white colonial imaginary's ability to perceive Black women as women, but also their bodily schema in a white world. That is, the bodily inheritance of coloniality of time severs their claim and position of women in the deepest sense of being imprisoned in, as Lugonis suggests, sex. And it is in this way that sexualized racist violation shows up on scene. It becomes the material mechanism that reminds and can reiterate the historical past so as to reinstitute the coloniality of race, gender, and time. Embedded in this colonial timeline, then, and a legacy we need to think carefully about, is the weapon of state-sanctioned rape as a racialized gendered process. In its contemporary manifestation, state-sanctioned rape simultaneously enforces and constructs normative gender formations as a way to maintain order. A phenomenological consideration of the structure of the racist encounter as a spatialization of temporality suggests that, although not in every racist encounter a woman of color endures entails rape, state-sanctioned rape is a logical consequence. To have one's existence spatialized, an effect of the relegation to the deep past, is to be reduced as a sex receptacle. It is to live and perhaps die by the colonial mark of sex. So what does this mean about those who are legible as women? So I'm almost done here. The historically entrenched and socially habituated norms and violence of coloniality are inherited in legible genders, the ones improved and protected by the state. So this brings us back to McConnell's closing argument, right? The reminder to everyone in the room, they should know that soccer mom actually denotes white woman. This means that we do not just stand in the stream of history, but that history is in us, in our embodied gendered lives, in such a way that can reiterate and reify the past in the present. Well, I am interested with how this colonial legacy of sexual violation against colonized females shows up in women today. How does it construct woman as white today? How is woman lived through this history? So I unpack that in the book in deeper ways, but the brief comments I have here is that to undertake a normatively gendered mode of being in the world, feminine existence in this case particular, or to have it imposed on you as a white subject, is to inhabit an existential aesthetic of sexualized passivity and submission. When read as a colonial gender formation, though, becoming a woman as a feminine existence also inherits a colonial history wherein woman is constituted not merely as sexualized passivity, but through racial prohibition that authorizes and even requires violence against women of color. In other words, to take up feminine existence is to inhabit a norm that not only kind of reiterates heteropatriarchy, but constructs and is constructed by a colonial distinction between gender and sex. And it's that same distinction that frames and allows for the state-sanctioned rape against women of color. So while I've talked about length, about this historical use of rape to constitute woman as white, in the book I talk at length about how this reiteration often takes shape in girls and women, or those who are perceived to be girls and women, through white fears about rape, and how the mobilization of a racialized fear is central to the anticipation of rape in such a way that also renders women white. Even as girls and women, including trans women and those perceived to be girls and women but do not self-identify as such, have empirical reason to anticipate rape, meaning it's likely to happen. I am concerned with the way a racialization of fear distorts the empirical reality such that the anticipation of sexual violence and violation is displaced. One anticipates fear in the wrong way. And that again kind of falls us back into the coloniality of gender. This displacement is what encourages and reifies normative womanhood, and so entrenches normative gender bound to histories of white, cis, hetero violence. So that's what I talk about in the book, and then I'll just end with some remarks about what I don't talk about and the questions that I have. What I don't talk about is how those who become women, who have also endured sexual violation, carry on norms and habituations of the coloniality of gender. So in other words, because I'm thinking about anticipation and the history, this before, what happens when that before comes mixed also with violation itself? So what happens when, say, a white woman is subjected to sexual violation? How does that, what changes or how does that colonial history continue to operate? Does something fissure in a girl or woman? Meaning, is there a rupture in the event and aftermath of a rape or other sexual violation that undermines or potentially could undermine the colonial schema? Which isn't to say that sexual violation is liberatory, but how does one recover from an aftermath in such a way that can alter the course of history in one's embodied experience? Since sexual violation is also shared across the coloniality of gender, is there a way to understand rape as also paradoxically deracializing, or is rape always doing different work in the constitution of racialized gendered life? Another way to put this is, when a settler man rapes a settler woman, what is happening with racialized subjectivity in that moment? What is the relation between the settler woman and Black female in that specific aftermath? And what happens to the temporalization of feminine existence when conscious anticipation of rape comes after rape? So here I'm thinking of child abuse in particular. And then less focused on sexual violation, what kind of aesthetic gender habits does a settler subject need to undo the way colonial history shows up in the body? These are just some of the questions I have, and from just this aspect of the book alone. So I just wanted to end by noting, especially for students in the room, contra certain traditions of philosophy that encourage you to assert a finality to your ideas. I think I've only caused, and I'm kind of stealing this from Butler, more gender trouble for myself. I only have more questions, so I look forward to those you may have for me too.
We have about half an hour for discussion. So if you have any questions, comments.
Just have a quick clarifying question.
Yeah.
When you say sexual violation, does it refer to the state doesn't do anything, or they turn a blind eye?
It's both, I think, and I kind of maybe being broad in how I deploy the term state-sanctioned violence, because I want to suggest that any kind of encounter between differently positioned racialized subjects has some, particularly if it's a white person violating a non-white person, that there's some state support behind it. So it's not just at the hands of the state, although that is how I'm using it in this case with Holtzclaw. But that those of us who are positioned as white settlers have some state support behind what we do, even if that doing is violence.
I was wondering if you could talk a little more about the racialization of fear and how it's distorting.
Yeah. So the way that I talk about it in the book is by trying to connect the historical myth of the black male rapist, or as it shows up in our contemporary form, the Mexican rapist, or any non-white male rapist, to another popular myth, the myth of stranger rape. That I find these to be, I argue that they're the same myth, although interestingly enough, we don't talk about how they're the same myth, and that those who are assigned girl at birth, not even, regardless of racial position, but I think, which is what a lot of the sociological scholarship shows, that those who are assigned girl at birth get taught to fear the stranger in really significant ways. And feminist scholars have thought about how that constrains one's relation to space. And of course, I'm thinking, well, what it does is make one anticipate rape, but in the wrong way, right? And actually, in learning to anticipate rape in the wrong way, it actually produces a social context in which rape can persist as a pervasive feature of those who are positioned in girls' and women's lives. So the empirical reality of sexual violation, with the exception of those who are American Indian or Indigenous women, are that you are more likely to be raped by someone you know in your home. Though interestingly, most people who are girls and women or are perceived as such, and I like that, I use that distinction because you can be perceived in ways that are not how you self-identify, right? So it's out of your hands, particularly when it comes to violence in many ways. You're taught to fear and anticipate rape in ways that are more likely to encourage it. So you run home because you think you'll be safe there, but that's the very place where you're more likely to be harmed. So I think about how that fear is displaced in a way that supports and empowers white supremacy, right? Such that, say, white women fall in the hands of white protectors, which are actually not protectors at all, while their fears are projected onto kind of the outside, the stranger. So the example I always talk about with students is how many young girls and women in particular fear walking in dark places at night. Like on a college campus, you don't walk across from the library to your parking lot, or the parking lot to wherever you're going at night. And the reason is because of the fear of rape. But it is a misplaced fear, and so I think about how that reorganizes kind of space and time. So that's the anticipation. That anticipation of the stranger, for me, is the kind of historical mutation of the turn of the 20th century myth of the black male rapist. Yeah.
At the end, you went over something about children, and it went really fast. So could you say some more?
Yeah.
It just, I didn't even really catch it.
Yeah, so I started to think about how much of my interest in the anticipation of sexual violence may not be taking into account those who may have already experienced sexual violation in ways in which their cognitive development doesn't allow for a kind of conscious recognition and recollection, and so this is with children. So I'm thinking of like what happens with these social discourses of fear and anticipation in the subject, and particularly kind of the, in relation to gender, when one has already experienced this fear or experienced this kind of violation. What changes in the anticipation, right? My thought is phenomenologically that it gets heavier, right? But I also, it wasn't a question that I was thinking about. So I was kind of cued into this moment in one's life when one is assigned girl, in which one's kind of, as Beauvoir accounts for it, one's embodiment becomes objectified and sexualized in ways that are new. And that this is really when the fear starts to show up and you start protecting yourself and so forth. But that, of course, covers over those experiences that happen in childhood.
When one constructs oneself as a victim in the very construction of oneself as a woman or girl.
Yeah.
Right. So instead of anticipation, it's carried.
Yeah, it's already there. Yeah, and so that already there-ness, I guess, it was not something that I was thinking of, and so I'm just trying to think of those things together. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, so my question is actually related to the one that Spencer just asked. In the book, I loved this moment where you talked about, Trump's comments about Mexican rapists, and then you said, even amongst people who would never say that with their words, we end up saying that with our fear. So I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about how that works for you, and just how we might theorize this idea of fear as a thing that is a political act in the world or has political consequences.
Yeah. So I think that anti-racist white people like myself have this tendency, and I think so. Shannon Sullivan's book, Good White People, is great for those of you who haven't read it. It points out the way that, so-called good white people have this capacity to be like, oh, look at all those bad things that white people say. And so when Trump made his comments about Mexicans as rapists, right, there was just all this outcry of how horrible this is. And obviously, yes, it's horrible. But I had been thinking so long about the way in which that kind of racism is lodged in our embodied lives through gender in ways we don't see. And so even though one may not, so the way that I put it in the book is, even though one may not say what Trump says, you might actually be living out gender in ways that already say that project that. And so, as much as one can distance oneself from someone like Trump or someone who makes those comments, I began to think about, well, what about if it's already with you and you don't know it and you can't see it and you don't hear it because you're not saying it, like, you don't say those things, but maybe you move in ways that do. And George Yancey's work on racialized embodiment points this out, that a lot of white women already comport themselves in ways that kind of project this fear. You clench the pocketbook in an elevator with a black man and so forth. And so that is, for me, the bigger concern, because as a phenomenologist, I'm really interested in our pre-reflective life. Like, that's the language a phenomenologist uses, the large part of our lives that we're not aware of, they come in another layer of our experience. They're not conscious. We may even never get a hold of them, and even as we do, as I'm realizing the book, all of these other things fall out of view. And so for me, in my own personal experience, I think, and I kind of discussed this with you in the podcast interview, Sarah, is that, as someone assigned girl at birth and standing in this normative stream of white settler history, but also as someone who rejects and resists that assignment for political and personal reasons, began thinking about how that fear has shown up in my life, even as I've tried to work on it. And I think that says so much about how powerful those lessons in fear and in gendered embodiment are, that one can be so careful and willingly subvert, and also need to subvert that imposition of norms, and then they're still there. So the way that I talked about this on the podcast with you was, I was literally writing this book and I was running at like 8:30 p.m. at night in my neighborhood. So again, this is a place I'm familiar with. For all I know, I could have even been working on this chapter. It literally was not that long ago. And I'm running at night, and I like have this feeling well up in me, like, oh, should I look over my shoulder? And I just, like, in my mind, I'm like, no, but it was in those moments where I'm like, that's it. That's the thing. That's the feeling, and that even if I can notice it in myself as someone who is spending so much time thinking about this and has spent so much of my life getting away from my normative gender assignment, and it's still there, And I think that shows up for more people, and I'm concerned about that. Like, those are things we can't get a grip of, but also we don't try to acknowledge what that fear is doing.
So in regards to anticipation, I was just wondering, does anticipation project itself in, like, self, like a temporal self or a spatialized self? And if it is like in the spatialized self, is that due to kind of seeing the self as becoming an object for the aggressor in those situations?
Yeah, it's a great question. Anticipation is an interesting temporal experience. So in Heidegger's Being in Time, talks about like anticipation is this necessary anxiety that we all have as being human. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to do as a feminist phenomenologist is to say, no, for some of us, anticipation is about this death possibility that's like in us because of how we're positioned, not just because we're human. And so this anticipation of rape, which I talk about as a haunting, that one's death is haunting one's existence in such a way that the very impossibility of you existing is like deeply with you. And I think that this happens, of course, for colonized people, for people of color, for women in relationship to rape, other sexual violations, so that anticipation is temporal in the sense that you know there's this thing as a future, but you're just not sure if you're gonna have one. Or you know you're gonna have one, but you're not sure what its content will be. So like the anticipation of rape is like, I know that in my future I could be subjected to sexual violation. And that is very different than being like, I just don't know what's gonna happen to me in the future. Right, and you could say similarly with when people of color encounter the police, right? That this is very possible in the future. So I'm interested in that anticipation as very different than what, say, Heidegger talks about as like this general foreboding that we have of the future as part of just anxiety of being human. That some of us carry around this kind of anticipation as just like the end of our life or the violation of ourselves in very deep ways is with us all the time.
Thank you for this talk. There are a lot of really compelling insights, and I really appreciate the level of clarity that you're navigating these complex issues with. And I have sort of, I guess, two question areas. The first is, I noticed that in your talk there seems to be some conceptual slippage between colonization and racism / racialization, and between Blackness, women of color, and Native women, that folks in like Indigenous studies and Black studies are trying to like point out that, yeah, while like racial slavery and colonization of the Americas were entangled, they're nonetheless sort of distinct. And so I was curious as to your thoughts about those distinctions, and whether or not holding those distinctions and those tensions and those entanglements in play might inflect your account of colonial temporality in different ways, or on the other hand, if there's something about the focus on lived experience that makes those conceptual distinctions not so salient. Mm-hmm. You know, so like if we're diagnosing like histories and political logics, then it might make sense to disentangle them. Mm-hmm. But in terms of lived experience, maybe that doesn't matter so much. So that's the first area. And then the second area is, towards the end of your talk especially, I think you talked about ways in which perhaps we can view what's consigned to the past as being present in some way, right? But I'm sort of wondering whether or not part of what the paradigm of colonial or settler time does is, in tandem with this linearity, is to sort of enframe our political responses as saying, well, no, the vanishing Indian is not in the past, they're present, right? But also whether or not there's still a displacement of indigenous notions of time, right? And so I'm wondering if you could talk about the ways in which indigenous time might provide some friction to the colonial temporality that you're talking about, and maybe that possibly comes up in the notion of recovery that you're gesturing to.
Yeah, great questions. The first one I think is one that I wrestled with a lot, right, in the book, knowing that there was there. So one of the things I say in the chapter out of which what I presented to you now emerges is that I am doing some sweeping, like potentially homogenizing gestures that, especially as a white thinker, could potentially run lots of problematic risks. And yet I say that the function of making this general claim about colonizing temporality is because one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is talk about a settler norm of gender. And I think in some moments, right, it makes sense to kind of consider this larger colonial project in relationship to the way settler ideology comes to live out, which does actually make some very sweeping generalizations about all colonized people. So the phenomenology I'm really giving is around kind of a phenomenology of colonial normativity in this sense, which in itself, I would argue, does erase the distinctions that you're pointing out. And I think the work that we see Indigenous thinkers doing is trying to kind of give kind of nuanced accounts of these specific histories. Yet I do want to say that there are some similarities that we can tune into, like this use of sexual violence in particular, even though it has very disparate histories and materializations across time, and even today, they can tell us something about a colonial norm, right? So that's kind of what I want to hold on to, at least in the project. But if I were to attend to the specificity of the use of colonial race, then yes, there certainly may be other insights that are kind of gleaned out about the way time functions very specifically in those moments. So I take your question to be the need for more work, right? Not that my work covers it all, but the reason I do make those claims is I'm trying to make sense of a settler norm, knowing that it is a norm, and that it does try to produce itself as this contained thing. So that's the answer to the first question I would give. In relation to the second question, I think one of the things I find myself sitting with now is the question of freedom and different visions of freedom and self-determination that emerge out of in various contexts, and that one of the things that colonial structures do is kind of continually, I think, try to cover over those different conceptions of self-determination and freedom. This is why I think focusing on normative violence can be so helpful, as like one of the sweeping things that it does is trying to kind of eradicate like these other possibilities, because they are present in a way that pushes back on, that can bust open the whole operation of the norm itself, right? So I understand the use of violence as this thing to eliminate all of the people, right, and all of the ways of thinking that can kind of explode, right, the colonial operation. So I think, yes, so in a sense, it's a present that is very much in the present as a problem, right? And it's a liberatory problem if we can kind of create space and open up space for it. But I think the use of violence is a way to try to eliminate the various kind of voices that you're gesturing to.
I have a question. I'm really excited about your work, and I really appreciate that you're doing this work. So for today's talk, I think I would like to ask you about something that was probably implicit but not explicit in the talk, which is the binary gender. And queerness, where queerness comes in this idea of coloniality of gender, and its distinction with sex, right? So when I talked with some of the students here in the decolonial thought class, when we read Lagunas, we talked mostly coloniality of gender in terms of binary gender, like imposition of binary gender. Right? So gender as a colonial tool or tool for colonization was actually the binary notions, right? So if we think about like Lee Simpson, as you're familiar with, queer normativity, right? There before colonization, gender was a lot more fluid, right? But then yeah, it's the colonial idea that understands gender in a certain way. So women, female distinction is important, but and also actually just thinking of my own work. Like I'm looking at the new women's movement in Asia, and in Asia there was no idea of woman before the new women's movement because it was mostly relations. They were defined as daughters and sisters, and so there was no idea of woman, right? So this feminist movement actually brought in the idea of woman, right? But then it wasn't female, male only either, right? Before, so it was much less binary. So I wonder, like, if we consider this queerness as pre-coloniality, right, and binary gender as coloniality of gender, then would that change anything about what you talked about in terms of temporality, colonial temporality, right? Perhaps in terms of rupture from the past, where gender used to be fluid, right? But then now you have to be in like boarding school, whatnot, right? So I think, so I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit more about queerness and gender fluidity in this context.
Yeah. I have lots of thoughts, so I'm just trying to figure out how much of them I want to vomit at you. So, of the many motivators for thinking about this book, one of them, and I think this goes back to the questions that were just asked, were to really think about how kind of legacies and histories of violence and normativity have shut down gender freedom, what I would call gender freedom, and possibilities for gender that not only have destroyed, right, other kind of conceptual schemas and ways of living out our existence that may or may not be gendered at all, but that also then continue to just reify this binary. So I became kind of really interested in how this binary and the colonial norms, this goes back to kind of the sweeping claim of the norm, just continues to decimate queer possibility. And queer possibility in this very kind of much broader sense of the decolonial possibility. And so I am, in the book, account for kind of paying attention to this pre-reflective operation of the norm as something that eliminates queer possibility and decolonial possibility for existing. And I want to try to expose it to make more room for different modes of existing. And I think that so I would say in terms of what that means about what kind of recovery to do with the past is a big question I still have for myself. I think that's one of the things that I left with, is that it was so much trying to tend to what is showing up in the present still and how. But as someone who's deeply committed both to myself and to others to kind of opening up different possibility of thinking, well, how do we, in this kind of collective radical, we recover a past, and what past, right? And how many pasts, and what does that recollective work look like? And how do we not reiterate structures of coloniality when they can slide into the present in these really invisible ways? So the question of queerness for me is fundamentally bound to a decolonial aesthetic, but exactly how to realize that are questions I still have for myself. And I think that so I think this is why, for me, thinking as a settler, since that is how I am situated, that recollection is going to look different, right? And that queer aesthetic for me must look different than it would be, say, for someone who stands in the stream of history and is in this position as someone who has been colonized. And those are questions that have been opened up for me, is I think what I was so much trying to get a hold of is how is one standing in how is one living out that stream of history? And the questions that I now have are, well, what do we do when we kind of think about it this way? And I don't know yet. but it's the live question that I have. But for me, yeah, I link kind of this queer possibility with a decolonial aesthetic, but I think that it must be different. It must be lived differently, in different ways. So yeah, I think the work that I'm doing is thinking of it as a settler person to understand what a queer aesthetic looks like in a way that doesn't kind of recapitulate these things. I actually think it's quite hard, as was just pointed out to me by a colleague who is doing work on what she calls the coloniality of voice, that there is an insistence that you have to speak up to be liberated, right? Mm-hmm. That without coming to voice, you are somehow utterly oppressed. And we had this really interesting conversation about the way in which she's like, are there moments in your book where you may be suggesting that without knowing? And I'm like, well, that's precisely possible, because that's how I'm suggesting coloniality operates. So I feel like there's so much to get a hold on. So yeah, refusing to speak in some ways, refusing to come to voice, maybe important parts of queerness. But I think that, yeah, I don't know what that looks like yet. Yeah.
I also want to join in thanking you for this wonderful, provocative, clear, and important talk. I have some questions that I want to piggyback on Chad's as well, as I think we had similar questions. And I hope it doesn't get too technical. But I'm also worried, or I'm wondering about the exceptions you pointed out in your narrative. So on the one hand, we have the situation of chattel slavery and the desexualization and genderization of Black bodies, and then the exception that you noted was the rape of Black women. And then the other exception was the case of interracial rape, right? That Native American women are more likely to be raped by non-Native American men. And I'm wondering if poking at the exceptions complicates some of the story about the colonial project and the way in which the colonial construction of temporality history works. I have two entangled questions here. So one has to do with a disambiguation between temporality and historicity. And in the emphasis of lived experience, of course, but there is a relationship, right, between the kind of, in the response to this other question about how individually we experience temporality in this anticipatory way towards death, which is entangled with an experience of a placement within history, but they're not the same thing, right? So that's kind of one question, and the way in which those two things can entangle within a particular experience of the body. Might be some way to deal with this issue. But then on the history side, I'm thinking of other Black studies scholars like, I apologize for bringing up this name, but Tommy Curry's work that talks about how like even Black men might experience sexual violence as slaves. I don't know if you want to talk about it as rape in the same way as you would with the rape of Black women slaves. But whether or not that's even an exception, right, is a question I think Curry has really provocatively asked. And then C. Riley Snorton's work on Black on Both Sides, right, kind of gives us a similar problematization of the supposed exceptionality of the rape of Black women and the way in which Black female bodies were used in the service of the construction of sexuality and gender for white women, as kind of furthering this challenge of radically desexualizing and degenderizing Black bodies. And so to that point, right, so if those kinds of concerns problematize the history narrative that Lugones is pointing out in this disambiguation between different types of settler and colonial violence, I like Chad's suggestion that maybe this doesn't matter too much when it comes to the concerns for lived experience, but that's the second half of my question. Like in the lived experience part, is there some necessity of maybe further nuancing the ways in which temporality and historicity are constructed, not only in terms of our subjectivity, but also our consciousness, right? So like there's a way in which you can talk about temporality as consciousness, like this is what we're looking at details. But subjectivity is not just consciousness, right? Subjectivity is also the lived experience of the body. In those other like kind of visceral, pre-reflective like things that you mentioned before, like when we touch our possessions closer to us, or we kind of cross the street. So I don't know. I'm just wondering if you could speak maybe to whether or not these sorts of issues are germane, or if they're just kind of phenomenal, which it might be.
I mean, I don't think they're nitpicking at all. I think they're important questions that, I mean, I think like all work gestures to the more work that needs to be done and the more questions that exist. In relation to the question of historicity and temporality, I mean, precisely one of the reasons why I want to tune into temporality is because in feminist philosophy, the gesture to tend to time is really to tend to historicity, and in phenomenology, the gesture to time is to tend to temporality and not historicity. And so not thinking about them together because I think one of the things that you get from reading Merleau-Ponty's notion of anonymity is that the social world is already in your sense of time, your individual sense of time, so your embodied time consciousness, to use Husserl's kind of language. So those things are actually all entangled, and this is what Beauvoir's work in the second sect shows up, that historicity and temporality are actually entangled. So we can disambiguate them in certain ways, but as we are living them out, they are often not, right? My past is not just my past. This is precisely what I think classical phenomenology misses. It's as if like my time is just my time, and like this, I'm just this subject in history, and history has nothing to do with my time. So I actually want to hold on to the ambiguity of historicity and temporality in some way, while also noting, of course, that they're not the same. Because I think that if we don't, then we don't realize how my time is actually not my time, right? That in some way history is part of my time. So that's one of the reasons why I want to retain some sense of ambiguity between those two things, while also kind of suggesting, yes, of course, that of course they are different. I think that the points that you're making about the exceptional cases are quite important. I don't think they're actually nitpicking. I think the way that I would answer that question now, although I think it opens up a lot more, is that I do want to suggest that there is something to tune into with what happens to those who are positioned as females, and that's kind of, I gesture to the kind of accounts of genocidal rape as a particular reproductive hijacking that happens. So although various people are kind of subjected to sexual violation in colonial histories, that I want to say that there is something shared about people who are positioned as female in relationship to a certain kind of reproductive hijacking. Now, that's not to suggest that other people are not, but I think that that's a helpful way to see some of the connection. So even when we're talking about the exceptional cases, I think that's a helpful way to see a connection across colonial operations. And one of the benefits of seeing those connections without just saying, well, we have to only focus on the very specific, right, accounts, right, which are important. But one of the benefits for me of seeing those connections are to kind of help think about certain generalizable structures that we might want to kind of be able to point out, even as they have different articulations and modulations in certain ways.
Our time is up. Please join me in thanking our Thank you so much for coming.
Literally.
given a couple Russian areas, but the question
try to get you to. I should, but I already talked about yeah.